Okay, a very fine and good morning to you all. I see some sun behind some of you. Fantastic. With those of you with the real backgrounds behind you. Um, and as people enter the room, I will just explain a little bit more. First, about the framework. I was hoping to be here last week for the first shiur, but I couldn't. So in terms of the content itself, two notes regarding, I hope that everyone has received the email. Just raise your hand if you received the email with info. Okay, I see some hands. If you have not received an email, then just please let us know at info@scandin, SCANDIN.org, and so that you're on the list for all the info. Regarding the books that will be the basis for our shiurim, we've reached out to the publisher, and we have quite a few sets already on their way, and we will have more as soon as we get a list from everyone. So please let us know if you will be if you would like the set of books that we will base this shiur on. Today's shiur, we're going to have a shiur on some of the principles of Judaism. And what we're going to do throughout this course is that we're going to have subjects that we learn, such as Shabbat, Kashrut, blessings, the brachot. And throughout, we will also put in a few shiurim which are giving fundamentals and principles of Judaism, as we will do today. So these are actually quite important as a basis for all of the shiurim. So another technical and the last technical thing is that we have received some requests to record the shiurim. I just want to be clear that the recordings will only be on a private channel for those who are in this room, so that you will be able to. So I hope that you'll feel comfortable to ask questions and to have a conversation as if we were in a closed room. It's not going to be published anywhere else. So since some people cannot make it every week, and it is very important, in the chat room, I am going to write the email in case anyone is missing it. Okay, let us begin. And today we will be trying to tackle one of the mysteries and one of the most important and difficult subjects in understanding Jewish halakha. And I feel that is very important, and I really hope that once we finish this shiur, you will have a better understanding. One of the questions, or one of the most complicated things, I think, for many people who are beginning practice in Judaism is, why is it so difficult? Why do we have two opinions about everything? And why is it that what I do here, suddenly I hear somewhere else that someone else learned something else from their rabbi? I open up one book and I see something, and then I open up another book and I see that. Anyone have that experience? Just raise your hand. I see some nods from some people. So hopefully we are going to tackle that today and try to have a better understanding of how and why. Helena here is helping us out with the administration. Please just check if there's other people in the waiting room, just so that we don't miss it. Thank you so much. Okay, so as always, this is an open Beit Midrash, and we really hope that you will step in and be active, as if a Beit Midrash in its setting, in its proper setting, a house of study, is never quiet. If any of you had the experience of walking in to a yeshiva, it could be a boys are very, in Israel especially, there's fantastic women's study programs, women's Bet Midrash, it's never quiet. People are arguing constantly. People are discussing and debating. And I wish we could revive that. And I hope that we can also meet physically so that we actually start arguing and leaving our comfort zone of being muted on this Zoom. But please feel free to step in, to comment, and share what your thoughts are. Helena, if you could share the document, and we will begin learning our sources. We have quite a few sources to go through today. So I would like to begin. Yes, thank you. With an interesting passage from Proverbs, which the passage says, Shma b'ni musar avicha ve'al titosh torat imecha. My son, heed the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother. If you notice um, the wording, let's look at the Hebrew words a second. Shma b'ni, listen, my son, to the musar of your father. Musar here is translated as discipline, or it could be, you could say that it's to be of fine character. There's an entire movement a few hundred years ago that was called the Musar movement, which were very strict upon a person of how to refine your character so that everything that you did was true to your heart and to discipline at the same time. The word here is musar. Listen to the discipline of your father. Ve'al titosh torat imecha. The translation here is the instruction of your mother. But if you notice, the word used in Hebrew is Torah. Torah, we know the word. But what is interesting itself, I don't know if you have noticed, that the word Torah means to instruct or to teach, but it is a feminine form. Regarding the masculine of the father is discipline, and the form of the Torah in general is the feminine. In other words, when you talk about discipline, that's something which is more linear, which is more masculine. This is how things should be done. Whereas the mother is more laying the path or passing on from one generation to another. And we're going to see that further on. I think already in this pasuk, we can sort of grasp that notion that the Torah is something which is more feminine. In other words, it's something which one should listen to, which one is receiving. We received the Torah at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. We then gave it over to one another, passing over from one to another. I think in the world that we live in today, knowledge is becoming very linear, if I may say, following algorithms of Google, so that if you want proper answers, you turn to Google and you say, is this kosher? Has anyone ever done that? So in other words, that the answers that we're looking for are direct answers. But when you're looking for deep knowledge in life, hopefully you realize that it's not something, you don't go to Google for those answers. So already in Proverbs, King Solomon is telling us, don't forget or don't forsake the feminine side of receiving from your mother. And we're going to see later on how that fits into our subject today, which is following the local minhag or custom. In other words, we have different customs in different places as we are going to discuss further. So before we begin or go forward into the next source, I'd like to share with you a story which I think is going to bring forward this subject. A few years ago, I was I was in we were up in the Galilee in the north, and we came by Drew's Pita. There was a woman outside, a Druze woman, um, not a Jewish woman, a Druze woman from the Druze tribe, and she was preparing pita outside. And my wife, who was pregnant at the time, says to me, "Well, I'd really like a pita." So, of course, if your wife asks for something in general, and especially if she's pregnant, you stop the car right there and then. So I went up, and of course, the question is, well, is it kosher? Can we have this pita? And um, this Druze woman had pita and labane. Labane, which is this special cheese that she was making, like a sour cheese. And so I started asking her a few basic questions in order to determine whether it's kosher or not. And within a minute and a half, I determined that it was kosher, and I asked if she can make a pita for my wife. As I do so, this person at the corner of the restaurant, he gets up, a long kibbutznik with like this long classical mustache, and he he was angry, red-faced, and he stands up and he says, "And for you, this is kosher enough?" I said, "Excuse me, I don't know what is getting you so angry." He says, I want to tell you why I'm angry." And he comes up to me and he says, I have um, my grandmother, we live in Tzfat in Safed, and my grandmother had a restaurant. And of course, my grandmother kept kosher. This person doesn't look like, it was, of course, but he says, of course, my grandmother kept kosher. And this is a restaurant that has been passed down in the generations for close to 100 years, he says. And my mother continued and kept the restaurant in the same fashion that my grandmother did, and so do I. Suddenly, the rabbis in Israel come forward and they say that I cannot present my restaurant as being kosher unless I have a certificate from the rabbi of Tzfat. So who are you people to tell me that I am not kosher? I said to him, "Excuse me, but I think you're preaching to the choir, as we say. You're talking to the wrong person, because you're angry. I understand why you're angry, but I actually agree with you that the fact that we have created a system of this is and this is not kosher completely takes away, the passing on of course, if you feel that your mother, if you follow what your mother did and what your grandmother did, then I have no question that it is kosher." Well, it's not such a simple thing, because what if the person doesn't know as much as his grandmother did? And what if things have changed? And what if we can always bring in these questions of what if? But the point is that maybe or perhaps with the systems that we have set forward, that didn't used to be there, we actually lose the transference of knowledge. If every kosher label that is on a packet actually prevents us from knowing what kosher is, because someone is doing that job for us as well. But then a bigger question is, well, we have different opinions. And how is it that I end up in a situation in which what is good for me is not good for someone else? What I am following myself, someone else in the community just next to me. Here we have representation from different communities. And I'll give you one example before we go forward. There's different customs regarding how many hours one should keep separate between milchik and fleishik, between dairy, between fleishik and milchik, between meat and dairy. So, for example, if I'm not mistaken, in Denmark, um, I think Rav Yoav is with us, but and he can correct me, but I think in Denmark at least, they keep 1 hour between the flesh and the milk, between the meat and the milk. In Malmo, that was never the case. Malmo, a lot of people came from Poland, and Rav Yoav, I see that you're with us. What is the minhag in Oslo?
Yeah, most people also in Oslo do the same as Copenhagen, waiting 1 hour.
I can't hear you.
Most of the people in Oslo also keep 1 hour, as in Copenhagen.
Okay. And then in Malmo, a lot of people came from Poland, especially after the war. And for them, that was a crazy thing. What do you mean you keep 1 hour? We keep 6 hours. That is what you should do. So here you have people who are following what their mothers and grandmothers did in Malmo. And for them, of course, you keep 6 hours between. And then across the bridge in Copenhagen, you have people keeping something else. So what is right and what is wrong? And how do I actually, when I'm coming from the outside, so to speak, how do I manage to follow that and what am I supposed to do? So let's go forward in the sources. The Talmud Bavli in Eruvin says, brings the classic case of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Shammai and Hillel were the two Talmudic leaders at the turn of the century. Hillel, as we will see later on, became the leader of the Jewish people. And Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are their schools of thought. So Rabbi Abba, in the name of Shmuel, says, for 3 years, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagreed. These said the halakha is according to your opinion, to our opinion, and these said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. And in general, you can say that Shammai is very stringent. This is the way things should be. You must bring yourself up to the level in order to do this. And Beit Hillel, in general, was more closer to the reality and more flexible in terms of where people were. So they have this huge argument. In other words, do you uplift people or does the reality connect with people where they are? And we can have an entire shiur just on that. But they're having this huge argument, and this is just around the time of the destruction of the temple. And the big question is, how do we create the Torah in exile? How do we create something that will manage for us to survive outside when we no longer have a temple? Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. So, however, the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. In other words, the truth is, or the divine truth is beyond one or the other. Both of them derive, as they are both coming from scholarly and from people who are true to Hashem. Both of them are right. However, the halakha, in other words, the custom that we shall follow, the law that we shall follow, is according with the opinion of Beit Hillel, and in almost all cases, this is actually the truth. And this is how we follow halakha until this day. But how do you manage to understand that? A divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are words of the living God. In other words, both are right. How can that actually be? So this is a huge conversation in itself, and I hope we'll have a better understanding as we go through these sources. But then we have halakha. We have what is written down in halakha. In other words, what from this point on, from the point that this is decided, then the Mishnah is written by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the beginning of the 3rd century. And from there on, the Talmud continues, but the Talmud also continues disagreeing. You have two opinions at least about everything until you decide what to follow. And then finally, from there on, you have the classic books of halakha, such as Maimonides and the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch, all the way down till this day. And then you have something which is called custom. Custom means what is something that is followed in my community. And I would like to note that in many ways, customs that were maybe 1,000 years old in Germany, for example, customs that were very old that were followed, and each community had its own unique customs. The Shoah really disrupted a lot of this, because what the Shoah did was destroy not only the local communities, but destroy the local customs as well. And the people who are now settled, for example, in Germany, are not the original people who were there before. You have a lot of Jews who came over from Russia and settled there. But the people, the survivors, they came to the Scandinavian countries. A lot of them came to Sweden, went on to the United States, went on to Israel. So you have all of these European Jews who have many different customs even within their own countries, such as Germany. You had customs for the city of Frankfurt that were different than other places. And all of them come into Israel. And Israel's base is also a mix, because the majority at the time, at the establishment before all of the survivors came, Israel's base, to remind you, is within a completely different setting. Was not European, it was within the Sephardi, within the Arab-based country, Jews who had very different minhagim. And in that sense, if you move from one place to another, you're actually supposed to take upon yourself the local customs. So it may have been simpler, and one of the leading authorities of the previous generation, Rav Ovadia Yosef, actually said this, that if all Jews came from coming to Israel, would have taken upon themselves the Sephardi custom. But how could you actually tell the Ashkenazi Jew to stop eating gefilte fish, right? How can you tell them to eat kitniyot on Pesach, for example, when it's something that their grandmother never did? That their grandmother would consider one thing as chametz on Pesach, and how could you actually tell someone else to do that? So it actually doesn't work. It's not so simple to take that away from someone. So we end up in a very complex situation. Rav Yoav?
Two things I want to say. The first one is, if anyone has a question or comment, Rav Moshe David would be happy to answer once we want people to speak. In Scandinavia, we're very polite, but sometimes when someone is sharing, doesn't see someone who wants to say something. So try to take up your hand or just unmute yourself. So and do a little voice as I try to do here. That's one thing. The second thing about the content, it's interesting what you say. It's very similar to what happened after the exile from Spain, when Jews, many Jews came to Northern Africa and other places, mainly in the Middle East. And the communities had people from different places in Spain and people that were living there from before. And it was a mixture of traditions. And actually, one of the reasons the Shulchan Aruch became a so important book is that it came exactly when people were confused in the communities. What should we follow when you have a mix of traditions? And then the Sephardim, what we call today Sephardim, that is a mixture of Jews from Spain, mainly, but also Jews that lived in these countries before, they got a guidance, a very good guidance by the book of Shulchan Aruch, and because of that, they're following it till the day to day. The Shulchan Aruch. The mixture of traditions makes it complicated, and I think we live in a generation of a mixture of traditions. You spoke about 1 hour in Copenhagen. So Copenhagen had 1 hour, but Norway also had people that are coming from different countries and with different tradition. It's true that in Oslo we keep in the community 1 hour, but people have different traditions from the places they came to Oslo from. So we also a kind of mixture, and this mixture will probably continue.
So yes, if anyone would like to step in, I'm trying to, as you said, follow the sources and follow you as well. If anyone has anything to say, just please unmute yourself. I will also, I'm going to be even less nice than you, Rav Yoav, and say that it even split communities. For example, the community in Yemen, when you had the influence of the Lurianic tradition of the Holy Land, of the Kabbalists, they started influencing the majority of those countries. When it came to Yemen, there were those who said, we will not accept it. Even though he's the leading authority, he cannot change because we have been keeping this custom since the days of the temple. So why would we actually change that? Whereas there were many others who accepted, and it created a split within the community itself, which in some way exists until this very day. And in relation to spirituality, specifically in relation to customs regarding the grave and burial. There were many. So if this is how we buried our grandparents, how do you suddenly change that? So it's very complicated situation because we do want to finish custom. But I'd like to go forward and see why it is important and what is the basis for following custom. If anyone has anything to say, just please unmute yourself. Otherwise, we're going to go forward to the next source.
Okay, I have a question, if I may.
Yes, please.
So I was wondering, do you have to be consistent? I mean, saying that I adhere to Beit Shammai, or can you choose from case to case what to follow?
Yes, very good question. I think the simple answer is that one, in a general sense, should join a community and then follow the community's custom. In other words, the world that we have today, in which I can Google anything, as I said before, is we're losing the Torah of our mothers in that sense. The community is a mother. You join a community and you belong to it, and thereby follow its customs would be the simple answer. That I shouldn't pick and choose according to what I think is right, because that is not connected to and communities, as we're going to see, are very strong in and the basis for that in halakha. So let's go forward. We have quite a few sources.
Sorry, can I comment? Frederick's question was very good, and your answer, and then I have a comment around that. Because I think, I'm thinking very much about the difference between integration and assimilation. And I can respect that one should follow the local rule. That makes perfect sense in the collective. But I challenge this and question it, because let's go back to the Ashkenazi eating gefilte fish. Because the thing is we come with us, with our history, we come with the practices of our different communities when we enter a new community. And while in the public sphere, I would be respectful always of the community I am living in, it seems that some of these things that I hold dear to my heart that may not fit in the Norwegian community, but they are dear to my heart, and they're showing respect to my ancestors, to my background, I do in my home. So what would you say to that? Where in the community, I'm more than willing to follow the traditions, but maybe I'm in the privacy of my home, I take upon. So it's a question.
I think you're making things much more complicated, which is exactly the point. I think it's fantastic. I will just, in reflection to what you're saying, Anna, is it Anna?
Yes, it's Anna.
Yeah. So to what Anna is bringing forward, I will give my own personal answer to that. my family is of Ashkenazic background. My wife is half Yekish. She's half German from her mother's side, and she is Yemenite from her father's side. Both are both the German Jewry and the Yemenite Jewry are both sure of one thing, that they have got everything right. This is how you do things. So, but in my sense, having traditions from my own, it would be a shame to lose the thousands of years old tradition of the Yemenite side, because my wife has sisters. She does not have any brothers. So in that sense, if all of them married into Ashkenazi families, then what would be left if you only follow the Ashkenazi? You're losing all of that tradition. Seder night, for example, it's very important for us that we begin the Seder in a Yemenite fashion, sitting on the floor with a lot of leaves spread around the Seder table, as they did in Yemen. My children all know to speak the Haggadah in Yemenite. So given an example to strengthen what you're saying, because yes, we are living in an Ashkenazi sort of, and I'll also give you another thing which could maybe be more confusing. Our Bet Knesset, our shul in the Israeli community that we belong to, each chazan, each cantor will follow his own tradition when he is leading. So we don't have a specific chazan. It could be children. We try to, have youngsters leading the prayer, but each person will follow their own. That sounds very beautiful, multicultural in a sense. But what happens when one is reading one haftarah, the end reading of the Torah, for example, and one is not? What happens when you have the Yemenite Musaf, which does not have a repetition of the Amidah, for example, of the silent prayer? So it gets very confusing and not as simple as we would like. But we're going to leave that open. And hopefully, I think that's one of the points of this shiur, is that hopefully we're open to complexity. And that's what part of this is all about. But I did put forward quite a few sources today, and I hope we are going to manage to get through a few of them. So the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, but please, I'm very glad to have your comments and discussions. So please stop me rather than I stop you. Okay, we're going to go forward. Hasocheret hapoalim. Okay, with regard, some of this is we're talking about. We've been talking about customs, gefilte fish, but imagine what happens when you're talking about law, with the rights of laborers, for example. So you have one place in which a person has been used to working hours from 8 till 4. And then you have someone else who decides that his workers are going to work from 6 till 6. Does he have the right to do so? You have the right to change what is the norm? So the reason I brought this source is that it's not only philosophical, it's very down to earth regarding the laws. So with regard one to who hires laborers and tells them to rise exceptionally early and to continue working until exceptionally late. Okay, very relevant. I think you have norms in societies today. So as you did back then. So if this is in the locale where laborers are not accustomed to rising so early to continuing to work until so late, the employer is not permitted to compel them to do so. In a locale where employers are accustomed to feeding their laborers, the employer must feed them. If they are in a locale where an employer is accustomed to providing the laborers with sweet foods, he must provide such food. Everything is in accordance with the regional custom in these manners. So here the Mishnah puts it very clear that not only are you not permitted to change the customs according to, you're not an individual, you belong to society, basically. And the society that you belong to has norms that you must follow. So you, as the big boss of the fields, cannot come and say, well, if you want to work by me, you're talking about the poor laborers who don't have the privilege of deciding where they're going to work. They're looking there and they have to work by you. You're now taken over all of the lands in the region, and you decide that people are going to get up earlier and give you a longer work day. You're actually not allowed to do so. Not only so, you come and you say, well, I'm not going to feed you anymore. Your money for your food is going to come from your own wages. You're not allowed to do so. Where if the custom is in general that people are used to being fed, you must feed them. To give them sweets in the middle or to provide them whatever is, and this is a very important sentence, Hakol ki minhag medina. Everything is in accordance with the regional custom in these manners. So here we see that the Mishnah takes it into a very, in a sense of understanding the halakha, that this is not only, it's a halakha that is regarding custom, that you're imposing laws and regulations upon the owner of the field, usually the richer person, that he must follow the regional custom. If we go down to source 4, again, I'm going to welcome any discussion, but as I'm reading the sources, it's difficult to see if anyone is raising your hand. So just unmute yourself. Let's go to source 4.
Rav Moshe David, this is maybe a little provocative, but we had the last 20 years in, let's say, in Scandinavia, but all over Europe, that new movements came to settle in Scandinavian communities with total different customs in many areas, and without, as I see it, without the idea of taking upon themselves the local custom. So how does that fit in here?
One of the beautiful things that I've heard from some of the leaders of the Muslim community, for example, in Malmo, have been that they said, we must learn from you Jews the proper balance between integration and keeping close to heart what is, and not assimilating. And I think one of the key factors to that is this issue called Minhag. In other words, and maybe one of the resolutions is exactly what you said. I think one should be proud of who they are, but also be humble towards the society that you live in. And that's a very delicate balance. Maybe there's not a clear answer as in all of these things, as you suggest, but definitely you should be humble. But on the other hand, if you completely assimilate into society, I'm going to be like everyone else. If you look at the example of German Jewry before the war, before the Shoah, there was this idea of let yourself be a Jew at home and be a German when you leave the house. I think that you should, in the long term, that doesn't work. You have to be proud of who you are also outside, but fit that in properly. I think if every part of the society was proud of who they are, then you can have a proper discussion and figure that out, how that fits in. What is important to me as a society and what is not. The idea that an open society also is multicultural and in that sense, there's nothing important to me is not true either. You hear that also sometimes. Society has things which are important to them, which should be important. So it's not something parve, I would say. Rather something, yeah.
Rav Moshe David, I was hinting also at Jewish movements. Let's take example for, I believe, all the Scandinavian communities that I have people come here and say, when we tell them Shabbat is starting and at that time, that's the custom here. No, we follow the other, which means a new movement who moved in here and declare that the different tradition and different, and that goes for food, that goes for even almost for the prayer, almost every part of Jewish life.
It's easier for me to step outside Judaism rather than to the challenge where you are going.
I don't want political, but talking about the principle.
I think what we will see if we manage to get through some of these sources,
is that the halachic basis is very strong that you must follow the local minhag, and that if you have a luach, for example, if you have a timetable set by a community in a certain fashion, you are not allowed to halakha to change that. You cannot say, well, I am more stringent and therefore I follow something else. You're not allowed to. If a shul begins Shabbat at a certain time in a community and there's one shul, that basically takes over, that becomes the minhag that everyone must follow, specifically outside where others are seen. A simple example that I'll give you, which is very clear in halakha, is if someone comes from Israel, for example, where they're keeping one day of the festival, right? And they come into Sweden. The second you come off of the train, it becomes Yom Tov for you. Even though you've been traveling, you've been on a plane, and it's not a festival for you because in Israel we have one day and not two. Okay? The second you get off the train, no one is allowed to see you transgress the Yom Tov outside. In the same way, I would say that if you have a luach of a community, if you have a kosher system of a community, that is what must be followed. That is the local custom. Of course, what you do in your own home is one thing, but outside there's something everything is in accordance with the regional custom in these manners. And I think if let's go down, try to get through a few more of the sources. Source number 4 directly, I think, follows up on your question, Michael, and the Mishnah in Psachim. When we talk about customs, who has more varied customs than Pesach, right? We have things that could be considered chametz by one community and not chametz by another. And what are you obliged to follow? If your father became more stringent, let's say, about certain things, and he's eating a certain type of matzah, halachic discussion is, do you have to follow that? A huge discussion that we have today is something called kitniot. Kitniot, which are things that are sold like lentils in sacks, in which wheat and barley could easily get mixed up with them. So there was a minhag, a custom, not to eat those kitniot. Today you can say that's no longer relevant, right? That is not the case, as many might claim. But this is what you were following so that would, even for some, they would relate to that as almost chametz, and not even cook in a pan or a pot that kitniot have been cooked in. So it's one example in which you have huge differences between the Sephardi and Ashkenazi community. So the Mishnah in Psachim says very clearly, following up on on what you said, Michael, Ve'al yishaneh adam mipnei hamachloket. A person may not deviate from the local custom due to potential dispute. In other words, your truth, what you think is the divine truth, or you're thinking that you are following something more stringent, more extreme, something that you feel, well, why shouldn't I do that? Because if I can do it, I may as well do so. That is not the case, because you shall not change the local custom. And here we're going to get into discussion about what if the local custom is not based on halakha? What if it's against halakha? But following up this conversation, Rav Yoav, yes.
Yes, just say it's a good example, the idea of kitniot. One thing is, if I go to Morocco and everyone are eating kitniot, if I choose not to eat or to eat, it seems as if I should eat kitniot if I'm in a place where everyone eats, not in a place of a mixture. But for example, here in Oslo, we of course follow the Ashkenazi tradition and we don't eat kitniot. And then there are Sephardic Jews that have come in here and they have this as their custom. And they ask me, why don't we import for the kosher store kitniot food so that they could buy it? And it's not easy to tell them, no, we don't do it. But it's, for me, very important that we don't import kitniot. because then we like in our own community-owned store sell something that our community don't want to have or against our tradition. So we have this example of people who keep it at home, and I tell people, if you want to keep it at home, it's your issue. But our community tradition is not to have kitniot, and because of that, we can't have it in our store. And these kind of dilemmas of different traditions in the same place, we meet them all the time.
So let us go forward, and we'll see that these examples that we have are very, we will find them in the Talmud themselves. The Talmud following this Mishnah in Psachim gives the following story. The residents of Bet Sha'an were accustomed not to travel from Tyre to market day in Sidon on Shabbat Eve. In other words, these are two cities in Lebanon, actually, and they, Shabbat Eve means on Friday. In other words, if you have, you're not supposed to travel, in some cases even 3 days before Shabbat, because you might end up traveling on the Shabbat itself. But here you're talking about a very short trip. You can say, well, it's like taking a bus from one community to another. And they were accustomed not to travel. So the children came before Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was in Tiberias, the center of the Beit Midrash of the at the time. And they come to Rabbi Yochanan and they say to him, well, it could be that our fathers were able to manage without going to the market on Friday. However, it is not possible for us to do so. In other words, the situation has changed. And for them, they said, well, it's better not to do that. We don't have to complicate ourselves, then we might get stuck on Shabbat, etc. But here, it's not, we're in a dire situation and we really need to go to the market on Friday. Otherwise, we won't have a livelihood. So can you please, since it's actually not a halachic problem, can you allow us to do so? So he said to them, your fathers have already accepted this custom upon themselves. And therefore you cannot change it. As it is stated, Shema b'ni musar avicha ve'al titosh torat imecha. This is the pasuk, the passage from Proverbs that we began our shiur with. My son, hear your father's, here it says, rebuke, and do not abandon your mother's teaching. In other words, the father is representing the halacha, the linear, as we called it, this is how it should be done. However, your mother's teaching are the ancestral customs, things passed down from tradition. So if your fathers have already taken them upon themselves, then you must follow them, even though if you're in your logic, you think that the situation has changed. Of course, one of the difficult questions is, well, you can say, well, their grandfathers actually didn't follow that custom. So when does something become a custom and when does it not? When, and at one point do you say that a custom is something that we followed? And we're going to leave that as an open question. And this is a huge discussion of what is a custom and what is considered a minhag shtut, what is considered a custom that has no basis in anything. What if people just start doing something? Does that mean that you're supposed to do it? And what happens if a custom goes against halacha? Then do you follow the custom? And these are open questions. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of that today. Let's go forward to the next source unless anyone wants to unmute themselves. Let's go forward. Amar Rabbi Tanchum bar Chanilai. Rabbi Tanchum bar Chanilai says, a person should never deviate from the local custom. He says, we have a beautiful example of this. As Moses ascended to heaven, when Moshe went up to receive the Torah, he did not eat bread for 40 days. When the angels came down, when they were visiting Abraham, it says that they ate bread. When the three angels come to visit Abraham, so it says that he and Sarah prepared this huge meal for them. And they could have just said, well, they're angels, because that's what they do further on in the conversation. We've come to give you a message. So why didn't they do that in the first place and save 3 calves' tongues from this meal? So why? Because I think part of it is the issue of respect. That it's obvious to him that the angels didn't eat. Can it enter your mind that they actually ate food, rather say that they merely appeared as though they ate and drank? In other words, part of the respect that you shall have is to follow the local custom, the local minhag. And if it's Moshe going up to heaven, he doesn't eat. And if it's the angels that come down, then they pretend as if they're eating out of respect for the local custom. The Mishnah further on, the Talmud further on in Pesachim, we talked about Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and what happens, it's a very interesting case here in Pesachim, which further highlights our discussion today. The case is that what happened was that an entire community forgot the halacha. They didn't know what to do. And they didn't know whether sacrificing the Pesach lamb on the Shabbat was permitted or not. And they're asking around, and somehow it got forgotten. Everyone's asking, well, what did your father do? What did your grandfather do? What was done? And somehow the halacha had gotten forgotten. So they go to find a scholar, and they found Hillel, and they knew that he had learned from the leading scholars of the previous generation. So they said, if there's anyone out there, it must be him. And that was true. Hillel told them what should be done, and they immediately seated him at the head and appointed him Nasi. Nasi was both the spiritual and political leader of the time. And he expounded the laws of Pesach for the entire day. In other words, as a result of their assimilation, they had forgotten all of the halachot of Pesach. And he realized that he had to re-establish tradition for them. So he sat down, and the entire day, this was the day before Pesach, he goes through all of the halachot of Pesach with them. And he began rebuking them. And he says, how is it that you forgot? What caused this to happen to you? That I should come up from Bavel and become Nasi over you. In other words, the fact that you need, I think one of the points that Hillel is making here is that, which is maybe relevant for some of the Nordic countries, in order to keep a local custom true to itself, you must have a leader from in yourself. You must have someone who grows up with and is learned enough to become the next leader, because then you preserve the local tradition. But you lost it. And I had to come from Bavel in order to become Nasi over you. It was the laziness in you that you did not serve the leading scholars of the generation before you, Shmaya and Avtalia. So they were silent with this rebuke. In other words, the key to continuing local minhag is not having people from the outside. Rabbi Yoav says, well, what if you have people from the outside who come and start other minhagim? But if you have a strong leader who is local, then he preserves the local minhagim as halacha. So then they started bringing cases before him and asking, well, what do we do in this case, in this case? And then they said, what happens if one forgot to bring the knife on the eve of Shabbat? In other words, Hillel says to them that they can slaughter the lamb even on the Shabbat, but what happens if they forgot to bring the knife? If we can go down one more page, Helena, please. So he said to them, I once heard this halakha from my teachers, but I have forgotten it. Hillel, the scholar who had just become a Nasi, says, I forgot the halakha myself. However, I leave it to the Jewish people. If they are not prophets, they are the sons of prophets. In other words, does anyone understand this? What is Hillel's answer to them? Does anyone understand what he's saying? Please help me out. What does it mean by saying that if they are not prophets, they are the son of prophets?
He said that they have to make up their own rules if there is no authority to reference to, because they are related to the authorities, so they should be have the possibility to make up something within that frame.
Anyone else? So following along the lines that Lars is saying, I think that there's an issue of trust. That if you do something, then you have this knowledge within the people that we are the sons of prophets. And what the Jews do in an instinctive sense is what is right. So then they brought the knife, and even though this is a very community that says we forgot all of the halachot, Hillel trusts them to do what is right. And after they actually bring the knife, then he says, now I've recalled the halakha, that this is what we were taught, that this is what should be done. Which is, I think, a beautiful and very strong message that we have here, saying that actually what you see done in a Jewish community is the right thing.
I work
Yes,
I work as a lawyer, and there's sometimes you have to say to the associates when you have not time, or you have to trust your legal instinct, and some have more legal instinct than others. That's a kind of a connection with a legally body, so to speak. They have some people just understand it because they have a more solely connection to it. Other people have more formal connection with it, and they cannot trust their legal instinct. They have to read exactly what it is.
I'm gonna, would you agree with me that we can set that, even though as masculine and feminine in a sense, going back to the passage from the beginning, instinct or intuition is something which is more motherly in a sense, intuitive. It's not something that you learned in the books. It's something that you have a feel for, a larger holistic approach, one can say. So in that sense, the holistic approach of the motherly womb that is transferred down with Jewishness is this deep understanding and knowledge of what needs to be done. And in that sense, that could even be different from one place to another, which really opens things up, because we really want to know, is this what I do? That's what we started the shiur out with, and why it's so confusing, but maybe we can turn that around into intuitive knowledge, which is gained through connection. I think also in terms of that is one of the, why we, in the Beit Din in Scandinavia, someone could have the perfect knowledge, but if he's living off in the middle of nowhere and not connected to a community, then there's something lacking, then there's something which is missing. Because only when you've spent Shabbat with a community, it's not only the question, well, I read that there. It's getting this intuitive sense that you get being around in the rabbi's home on Friday afternoon and seeing how things are done. And I think a lot of that has been lost today. I'll give us a very simple example. My grandmother, when she was a traditional woman, so to speak, in the United States, from a family who had fled the pogroms in the Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things that was very strong was, this is how we salt the meat in order to kasher the meat. Today, no one knows how to do that anymore. It's not something that you do because you buy kosher meat and no one even knows that the salting is there. So we have, through the perfect world that we have created, which makes it very easy for us, we also lose the knowledge and the custom of how things are done. And when you're starting to learn that in the books, then in the Shulchan Aruch or whatever, and you haven't seen it with your own eyes, it's very difficult to make that bridge. Even within someone who's grown up in a completely religious world today. So what happens, just to go forward, and our shiur is a bit longer, because I do want to get through a few more of the sources. I hope it's okay with you. Let us go a bit more, a bit forward. The Rosh was the leading halachic authority in the 12th to 13th century, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. And he, of course, this is something which is, as we see, this is very relevant throughout the generations, especially as the Jewish community spread out and you have different customs. So he says the following: if you become unsure of halacha, do the customary. Meaning that if there is a loosening in halacha, you become unsure of what the halacha is, and you see the customary actions of others, then follow their customs. As we saw in the case of Hillel, he forgot the halacha, the leader of the, and what he says is, we have a trust in what people have done for generations. For you can rely on the great rabbis to lead others to follow the halacha. In other words, there were rabbis there before you. Don't think that you come out of nowhere and think that you know what is right because you read it somewhere. You know that in your communities for hundreds of years, there were rabbis there, and what was set forward in those communities, and this is true specifically, I think, for the Nordic communities. As I said before, there was a disruption in the local minhagim in almost the entirety of the Jewish world, but in the Scandinavian communities, you have a tradition in some cases of, for example, burials. What is the local minhag? It's been followed in Malmo for at least 120 years. So you can't just come out of nowhere and say, well, that is not actually what should be followed. You know that there were knowledgeable people before you that were sitting there, and if there was a custom that was against halacha, it would have been fixed. For you can rely for the great rabbis to lead others to follow the halacha. But if you are sure of knowing the halacha, you have no right to follow the custom that contradicts the halacha. So this is complex. In other words, when is it that something has been followed and it should be followed because there was someone knowledgeable there before? And when is it that something has just be done as a mistake and it has to be fixed? And these are huge discussions. But what we usually find, and it's also discussed now for hundreds of years in the responsa like we see here of the Rosh, is one of the most important ways to learn halacha, because it's exactly what we're talking about. The responsa are how community rabbis responded to questions. It's not what is written in the Shulchan Aruch, it's how they responded to questions. So in that sense, you learn from them. So when you see the discussions now for hundreds of years about this, you see that in many cases, when people tried to change the minhagim. I was reading last night in preparation for the shiur, someone who tried to change a certain custom a few hundred years ago, and he says, this prayer should actually not be said, it's against halacha. One of the prayers that is in the Rosh Hashanah Machzor. And he tried to remove it. But you see that it didn't help him because it's still there, because people were used to doing it. So it's very difficult to change a minhag that has been set for hundreds of years just because you think it is. And I think our sages were very aware of the fact. But on the other hand, like, what happens if a custom is just something that has been made up? Well, I like this idea, let's do that. So if we go forward to the 17th century in source number 9, so he has a very long, Rabbi Shmuel Segal, who lived in Poland and then in Germany in the 17th century, has a long, long discussion, which is a legal discussion about deeds and customs that have been followed regarding legal deeds, and when it is that you follow the local custom and when you should not. And after this, he's trying to put together a structure for when do you follow the custom and when do you not. And he writes in summary, I've summarized quite a lot of pages here, so it's not a good summary by just bringing one line, but just for the point, he says, in summary of all I have written, a custom shall only be followed when it is set and well known. In other words, if someone says, well, I know that this is what my grandmother did, what my great-grandmother did, that is something which is set and well known. But if something, and it's so deeply ingrained that we don't even realize that people continue doing it and that it can be trusted, that people know what they are doing because their grandmother did it, because they saw it as a child, they saw it as a 6-year-old, and they saw that this was being followed, and even unconsciously or subconsciously, they will know that themselves. Whereas when it becomes a logical discussion of saying, should this be done, and this is a new custom, or I like the idea, then that is not considered set and well known, and in that case, it can never contradict halakha. So, in summary, for a discussion that we can have for, I think, in specific cases, what do we follow and when do we stop a local minhag because it's a mistake? When does a local minhag take over? What do we do with mixed communities? I'd like to go back to summarize this and bring 2 final midrashim back to the philosophy of why is this the case? Why can't Judaism just be simple? Tell me what to do and I will do it. A question that we had a lot of hands at the beginning of the shiur. I think a lot of heads were nodding. You can nod your head if you agree. Why can't things just be simple in Judaism? And I'd like to bring it back to this idea of the mother's womb, which is the beauty of something being complex. Maybe it's not the world that we're used to, but what it is that we follow. So the Midrash in Tehillim, and then I see a couple of questions in the chat room that I would like to approach as well. And I thank you for your patience on this morning. If you need another coffee, you can get, so we have 2 more sources we're going to get through now. Rabbi Yanai taught, this is a Midrash in Tehillim. The Torah, this is my own translation, I hope it's okay. The Torah was not given clearly cut. In other words, the Torah was not given in a clear set. Rather, that with every word that Hashem said to Moshe, he would give him 49 reasonings for this to be pure and 49 phases of impurity. The Maharal of Prague says something beautiful about this. He says that there's nothing in the world which is actually pure, which is not impure, and nothing impure, which is not pure. In other words, everything has different facets to it because we live in a world which is a complex world, and everything has the divine in it. To say that something is impure and therefore it's not something something which is disgusting is to say that there's no godliness in it. So in that sense, this dichotomy is something which is against our understanding that God is infinite. So when Hashem gave, that was the Maharal of Prague of the 16th century, gives that explanation of this. So when Hashem gave imagine how confusing this was for Moshe. So Moshe is supposed to give over the Torah to Am Yisrael, tell them the 613 mitzvot, this is what you should do and should not do. And for every single thing, he gives them 49 phases of reasoning of why it is pure and not pure. So Moshe finally says, Ribono shel olam, he says, dear Lord of the world, when shall we understand clearly the true halakha? Hashem replied, quoting the pasuk, you shall follow the majority. In other words, that there's a holiness to the people themselves, which brings the divine down into the world. That when you see that Am Yisrael are following something, that in itself is creating a truth within the world. When you see that the majority are following something, that has created a truth that is that face of purity within this world. And that is Hashem's answer. And there's a famous story in which Moshe comes to the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva in his dream, and he's sort of portaled through to Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. And he hears Rabbi Akiva explaining, and he's Rabbi Akiva, who is from after the destruction of the temple at the time of Bar Kokhba revolt, and he's transferred into his Beit Midrash. And Moshe realizes that he doesn't understand anything that is being taught. And he gets very frustrated, and he says, but Hashem, has all the Torah been lost? Until he hears, and they ask Rabbi Akiva, where did you learn that from? And he said, this is something that we learned from Moshe at Sinai. So in other words, that truth has been transferred down in a way that Moshe does not understand himself. But that is the truth that has been transferred generationally down from Mount Sinai. So I'm going to leave that open for your own thoughts. What does that mean? Is it truth if Moshe himself does not understand it? And what does that mean? Our final...
I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
Okay, so if I'm getting you right, as a continuation of what Michael said earlier as well. So when, for example, let's say the Chabadnikim settle down in the cities with their own costumes, according to what you're saying, that goes against the halakha. So how should the communities react to that?
Can you repeat? I could not hear you well, sorry.
Oh, okay. So I'm saying that when, as Michael said earlier, for example, Chabad, when they settle down, they have their own costume, which many times go against the Minhagim, the local Minhagim. So that, according to what you're saying, that goes against the halakha, right? And how should the communities react to that, in your opinion?
I think it's very important for communities to be strong on their local minhagim. I think it's very important, and I think it's not only regarding Chabad that you mentioned, but in general, there's a sense of Google domination of the Jewish world. If I go back to that example, in which you have Batei Din, for example, who have been converting people in a certain way, or a kosher system. I'll give you an example, Frederick. I was in Italy, okay? And I was invited to a wonderful Venetian restaurant by the chief rabbi of Venice, okay? And in this restaurant, they were serving cheeses, and we've known through the Rispanza that I mentioned before for hundreds of years that Italy have their local custom, and they will be using hard cheeses that from the local production without supervision that no one else, including in Scandinavia, we wouldn't use. We won't get into the whole discussion. But anyway, if you've been in Italy before, that's the whole basis of their menu, is cheese and more cheese and more cheese and more cheese. So and it was a fantastic, we were invited to this restaurant. We sat there for 4 hours discussing rabbinical issues, and it wasn't even a menu. Every time, every few minutes, you get a new platter of something new. And it's something that I would never have, it was fantastic. 2 years later, this restaurant was closed down as a result of a lot of pressure that was put on, saying this is not properly kosher. So I see that as a disaster, because you're losing the local minhag, which is the local minhag in Italy goes back before the destruction of the temple, with all due respect. And certain things that were followed in the local synagogues could never be followed anywhere else. that is the local minhag, and therefore it's very important to keep the local minhagim, to be strong about it. I think it's a larger it's a modernization of the world, if I may say so. It's a Googleization of the absolute truth, in which we actually lose the Torah of our mothers. I'd like to go to our final source for today. So the Midrash in Shmot Rabbah says the following. Following up on the previous Midrash, Hashem said to Moshe, write down these words for yourself. And then the question is, if Hashem says, write down these words, what's he supposed to write down when he has all of these different reasonings? So the Midrash quotes the pasuk in Hosea, which says, for them, I will write for them the great things of my law, like strange things they are considered. That, let's just read the Midrash and then maybe we'll understand the passage. When God revealed himself at Sinai to give the Torah to Israel, he said to Moshe the following order. You have the Mikra, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and Agadah. As it says, God spoke all of these words, saying, even what a student will ask his teacher. In other words, God is giving over to Moshe every single thing that you will ask, including the question that you just asked, Frederick, and including, it was all given over to Moshe, okay? Then God said to Moshe, after he had learned it from the mouth of God, teach it to Israel. He said to him, God, should I write it down? He replied, I am not asking you to give it to them in writing, because it is known to me that in the future, the nations will rule over them and take the Torah for them, and it will be degraded by the nations. So the scriptures I will give them in writing, but the Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah I will give orally. If the nations will enslave them, the Jews will be different to the nations. He said to the prophet, I will write for them the great things of my law. They will be considered like strangers. And what am I, God, going to do? I will give them the Bible written, the Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah orally. Inscribe those words for yourself. Inscribe refers to the Bible, for according to those words refers to the Mishnah and the Talmud, for those are what separates the Jews from the nations. If we can stop the sharing of the screen, please. Now I can see quite a few of you properly. It would be nice just to conclude if everyone can show us just, if we can see your faces as if we're sitting together, it would be fantastic. So summarizing with this Mishnah, which I think is beautiful, there are certain things that are actually lose their depth if they are written down. The scripture was written down, and because so it was translated. And I think many times in our shiurim, in the Nordic Beit Midrash as well, if any of you don't come on Wednesdays, I invite you to do so. We see how the translations are not perfect. The day that Torah was translated to Greek was set as a fast day, as a day of mourning. Because when you think that you understand, then you see how things get lost in translation, and also the absolute truth takes over. Which is why Hashem says, I will give you Moshe, I will tell you everything. And you will get every single angle of the Torah from now until the days to come. And every single question that any student will ask his teacher was already said to Moshe. However, that will be transferred orally from generation to generation. That is something which is a process which can only be taught orally. It's not something that you can learn at home by reading a book. It's like we said, it's going to the rabbi's house on Friday and seeing how he prepares Shabbat with his kids. It's to see the beauty of Seder night that can never be the same if you have it alone at your house or if you see how it's transferred from generation to generation at the Seder table. And it's more complex today because we have different customs that are intermingling. What do you do at home and what do you do in the community? But I've hoped that I brought forward today the importance of the local minhag, the importance of that truth which is transferred down in a motherly fashion, in the intuitive fashion, which is something which is very important and lost in many senses today. And I think it's as a basis for all the shiurim to come back to this understanding and to follow up with these questions. I'd love to hear from you later on when we go through the subjects. Well, this is the minhag that I am seeing. Does that fit with what we have learned today? Would be the perfect question. Obviously, today, we have one question here that I'm just gonna, we have questions about, well, what do you do? Well, you have non-Orthodox communities, and what are the traditions that we are following? And I think it goes back to the question is about Reform communities, for example. And I think that basically there was a break in which tradition was broken and saying this is no longer relevant, and therefore this is what we make relevant. And what that was done, you lose tradition. But if you have something which was traditional in its sense, it's continued to this day, there is a basis for discussion. I think that's what we have learned today. So, Rav Yoav, any final comments for today?
No, it was a very good shiur. It's very nice to see many people that follow and stay even more than the hour we hoped it will be, but there were so many important comments, and the topic of the tradition is our tradition and halacha is very important, as you said, to keep and to hold. Maybe one story in the same direction as you said with Italy. They have in Italy is one of the places that have every city their tradition, and they have had in many years, many generations, they have a kind of bread for Pesach they eat, and the past years, the same as you said with the cheese, there were like halacha rabbis from Israel saying that it was chametz, the bread they are eating in Italy. And because of them, unfortunately, I have to say, many of them stop eating that bread. And it has been in their tradition. That's their Pesach tradition. And someone else that doesn't have that tradition will tell them what's correct and not correct. Was very unfortunate. So it's so important to keep the halacha, but know the tradition is also something that goes beside halacha together. Not against, but together with halacha, and so it's so important for our communities and for our heritage in many ways. Thank you for the words of Moshe David. I could say about next week maybe already that next week we are starting the brachot, and it will be Rav Yair that is leading. So you're all invited, and you'll get, if there any information you need to know, you'll get it by the email. Before we said last week that there will be homework in this kind of studying. I don't know if there's homework already for next week. So there is a homework, but I think they're already twice without any homework. So the people.
We'll see if we get, if we get the PDFs that we have asked in the meantime, and then we can send it out, and you won't get off the hook. You will get homework if we get the PDFs. But from this introductory shiurim, we're going to go into very tachlis, into practical brachot with Rav Yair for the next month. And so I really hope that you are all here next week. And we will also have a private channel with recordings for those who miss it. So I hope this was a good way for you to start off. Shavua Tov to everyone. Have a fantastic week. Keep healthy, safe, and happy. Shalom, shalom. Litaot.